Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I rise today to speak in favor of motion for the condemnation and denouncement of the most recent attack on lawful firearm owners by the Liberal NDP coalition federal government through amendments to Bill C-21, which the Chief Firearms Officer of Saskatchewan estimates will instantly criminalize approximately 75,000 Saskatchewan residents, and further calls on the government of Saskatchewan to explore all options to protect the rights of law-abiding firearm owners. This bill would constitute the largest gun prohibition in Canadian legislative history. Most of these now restricted firearms were purchased legally, used and stored safely, and have never posed a risk to public safety. If this bill is passed, lawful firearm owners in Saskatchewan will be prohibited from the import, sale, purchase or transfer of handguns, rendering the financial value of their legally owned property to zero, as it can no longer be sold or transferred. Another fundamental problem with this legislation is that it is a distraction and gross misdirection of policing and other justice sector resources which are in short supply and are desperately needed to address the core causes of crime. With this bill, we are telling our law enforcement resources to catch lawful gun owners instead of directing them to catch the real criminals. Legally obtained handguns in the possession of law-abiding citizens are not and have never been a public safety problem. Therefore, our government, along with Alberta, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, have called on the federal government to halt plans to use our already limited RCMP and municipal police resources to confiscate these legally acquired firearms from our residents. Our prairie provinces have already instructed their RCMP divisions to not use provincial funding for that purpose. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in response to the proposed federal government buyback program, our Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety sent a letter to the Saskatchewan RCMP in October 2022 stating the province's opposition to the use of provincially funded resources for any process that is connected to the federal government's proposed buyback of firearms. We have also called on the federal government to ensure that no funding for the Guns and Gang Violence Action Fund or other public safety initiatives be diverted to the federal firearms confiscation program. We want that funding to remain being used to fight the actual criminal misuse of firearms through tackling border integrity, smuggling and trafficking. Our 4 provinces have also called on the federal government to direct all communications related to the federal firearms confiscation program through appropriate channels, the PT ministers responsible for justice and public safety. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the introduced amendments to the federal bill C-21 would ban almost all rifles and shotguns commonly used by Saskatchewan residents to hunt or protect their livestock from predators. These amendments create a blanket ban on almost all types of Canadian semi-automatic firearms, which is any gun designed to load a new round after each pull of the trigger. This bill will do nothing to stop actually illegal firearm use. It is, in fact, that the majority of firearms used in crimes are obtained illegally, including being smuggled from south of the border. This lack of border control has led to the increase in gun violence that is largely related to gangs and more sophisticated organized crime groups. Our federal government should be supporting law enforcement initiatives that focus on stopping gangs and violent offenders instead of targeting law-abiding firearm owners. Our government fully supports initiatives that target the criminal and illegal use of firearms, including stronger enforcement and stronger penalties for illegal purchasing, trafficking, and illegal activities. Instead of focusing on criminal and illegal firearm use or on border controls, this bill is stripping away the rights of lawfully licensed firearm owners. Firearm violence is a much more complex issue that requires looking at the whole picture, requiring a better, complete government approach. Many other aspects, such as community and social programs, criminal justice system improvements, and healthcare resources should be considered. This should not be treated as a firearm violence issue only. This is a socio-economic and broader law enforcement matter. Hence, there should also be allocating greater funds towards the RCMP and CBSA to address the flow of guns at the border, including by rail and stricter rules on repeat firearm offenders. Also, Bill C-21 only focuses on the instrument and not the operator. Since 2003, the number of restricted and prohibited firearms has doubled from just over 550,000 to almost 1.2 million firearms, while the rate of homicide by handgun has remained constant. This analysis shows that there is no associated increase in handgun homicide with the increase in the number of registered, restricted, and prohibited firearms. Nor is there an increase in overall firearm homicide. This is important because with such an increase, if the prevalence of handguns was associated with an increase in homicide, one would expect homicide rates to also increase, but they have not. This is proof that legally owned firearms are not linked with homicide rates. Firearms are simply one tool of crime. By only addressing the tool, you are failing to address the root problems. If guns are eliminated, a criminal will simply continue to offend and victimize using other tools. Some have also argued that the proposed bill is a useful suicide prevention tool. But mental health professionals have stated that by forcefully removing the gun from a person suffering from mental illness and by doing so subjecting them to a high-stress situation with possible criminal consequences is not a suitable means of handling this issue. In fact, it poses the very real risk that mentally ill individuals will not seek help and instead conceal issues, fearing that their doctor, psychiatrist, or any other person might seek heavy sanctions against them. Another concern is that according to Section 70.3 of Bill C-21, a chief firearms officer may issue a conditional license, despite a person having engaged in a domestic violence, if the revocation constitutes a virtual prohibition against employment in the only vocation open to the individual. Instead of allowing the person to keep the gun because of their job, that person can always be redirected to administrative duties or a position that does not require a firearm. Here in Saskatchewan, many of our veterans actively participate in period outfits as reenactors to demonstrate the workings of the artillery at formal salutes, displays, reenactments, etc. While the guns used have been decommissioned and are no longer safe to fire live projectiles, many are used to provide black powder simulations for the audience. Under Bill C-21, these historical artillery pieces would be banned. If this were to happen, the public would be deprived of learning about a portion of the history of our country. We want our next generation to know this history. There is one type of gun that this bill does not restrict. That is ghost guns. A ghost gun is a firearm that has no serial number. This makes them difficult to trace, and they can be harder to detect. Parts of a ghost gun are usually individually manufactured. One part might be produced by a 3D printer, and other parts might be manufactured through a machine shop or illegally ordered into the country. Bill C-21 does not make creating or acquiring the components of gun illegal. There is nothing in the Firearms Act or associated regulations that prohibits a person from possessing a digital blueprint of a 3D firearm. Therefore, you could use a 3D printer to make a gun, or if you do not have access to a 3D printer, a firearms license is also not required to legally obtain gun components online, including the barrel, slide, and the magazine. You can even purchase them in convenient kits containing all the parts required. It is only after the gun has been assembled that it becomes illegal. This is because it then makes the builder a firearm manufacturer and owner, which does require a license and a registration certificate. But realistically, how could anyone know when this is done unless the builder chooses to inform the authorities? Yet another example of how this legislation targets legal firearm owners who have followed the regulations as opposed to addressing the root causes of firearm violence and violent crime in general. My government does not support the federal government's efforts to eliminate licensed firearm owners' right to access and use legally acquired firearms. Reducing firearm violence is a key issue and should absolutely remain a priority for the federal government. Our country already has a strict licensing regime for firearms purchases. The changes proposed in this legislation, unfortunately, do not address issues of organized crime and gang violence, illegal weapon smuggling, systemic causes of crime, or emerging threats such as 3D printed and ghost guns. It's time for our federal government to focus on the right things, criminals, not the hunters. Our government fully supports initiatives aimed at reducing the criminal use of illegal firearms, preventing gang violence, and stopping the smuggling and sale of illegal guns. We do not support laws that negatively impact law-abiding hunters, sport shooters, ranchers, farmers, and indigenous people who use firearms for lawful and good reasons. Our government will continue to stand up for the citizens of Saskatchewan, including our law-abiding firearm owners. I support the motion moved by Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.